movement. And the main focus of this chapter is going to be on civil disobedience movement and beyond. But just because we are talking about civil disobedience does not mean that we will not talk about Gandhi's early career in South Africa as well as in India. He could not have started the civil disobedience movement without all of that background. So we will be discussing all of that as well. And all of that will be part of your curriculum which can come for the examination. Before we go any further, if you have been finding my videos useful and you are not yet following me, so please subscribe to my channel and press on the bell icon so that you can get an update whenever I'm ready to post a new video or a webinar. Talking about webinars, it is now time for us to start looking at immediate content rather than just looking at the chapters. The board exams are coming. If you have been following my channel for a while, you will know that I have been organizing a bunch of webinars with some other teachers, very experienced teachers of history from CBSE schools, and they have been giving some very useful tips for students to follow to prepare for the examinations. So if you're interested in watching any of these webinars, don't hesitate to put your questions down below, or you can join our Facebook group. It is a closed group to keep the students safe and private. So you can apply to join that group. I will put the link in the description box, and you can put up your questions there as well. So without any more discussion, let us move on to discussing the chapter. So we'll first look at Mahatma Gandhi's career in South Africa very quickly. So South Africa was where the making of the Mahatma really took place. It was here when he first experienced racial discrimination and the fact that the white Europeans had been oppressing the colored people across the world. So if you all remember the very famous episode where he was thrown out of the train in Pietermaritzburg, and how he then vowed to fight against any discrimination. So what he then did was started his Phoenix Farm, started his Satyagraha there, and he experimented with different forms of protest, and ultimately he developed non-violent protest, which he called Satyagraha. He also worked to promote harmony between the religions, and he was also first alerting the upper caste Indians to their discriminatory treatment of low caste people as well as women. So after all of his experience for almost 20 years in South Africa, where he was no less than a celebrity really, and the South African white minority government was very happy to see him go, he comes back to India in 1915. And when he returns here, he sees that in the 20 years that he's been away, the Indian political scene has undergone a lot of changes. So he says that he sees that Indian National Congress has branches in almost all the major cities and towns of India. The Swadeshi movement has helped to broaden the appeal of the nationalist movement among the urban middle classes as well. He also sees the change from the moderate to the extremist phase in the Congress as well. Now the Congress is being led, the nationalist movement is being led by Lal Bal Pal Triumvirate. They were Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal. And of course, the moderates were kind of on their way out. And 1907 had also seen the Surat split. That is, the Congress had actually split into two factions, that of the extremists and the moderates. When he arrives in India, he also acknowledges Gopal Krishna Gokhale as his political mentor, and he also is very appreciative of Muhammad Ali Jinnah as well. Also, the fact that they were both Gujaratis also helped in connecting with him. So on Gokhale's advice, Gandhiji spends a year traveling around British India, and he tries to get to know the land and its people. And once he's done with his travels, his first major public appearance is at the opening of the Banaras Hindu University in February 1916. So he's been invited there largely because of his work in South Africa to come and give a speech at the opening ceremony. So at one level, his speech was just a statement of fact. That is, that Indian nationalism was an elite phenomenon. So it was really, the rich and the Western educated middle class who were in any way involved with the nationalist movement at that time. And also at another level, it was a statement of intent. What did he intend to do now in India? What was his intention about the nationalist movement? So his intention was to make the Indian nationalism more representative of the Indian people as a whole. Now, in his travels across India, he had discovered that 80% of India actually lives in the villages, and they have no connection, nothing to do with the nationalist movement at that point of time, except for a few scattered incidents and peasant rebellions and so on. But no modern nationalism had yet touched the villages of India, and his intent was to actually take this modern idea of nationalism and take it right to the villages as well. So after returning to India, he leads three small movements. Small in the sense, in terms of extent, they were very, very localized, but large when you look at the larger perspective, and you realize that actually these three movements was something that Gandhiji used to train himself as well in the methods, and trying to find out whether his methods that he developed in South Africa would actually work in India or not. So the first movement that he led was the Champaran Satyagraha. This was a peasant movement against indigo planters, and the peasants wanted to obtain security of tenure as well as freedom to cultivate crops of their choice and not be forced to only grow indigo. Then the second movement that he led was the Kheda Satyagraha. It was also a peaceful peasant revolt against high and rigid land revenue assessments. And the movement asked the state for remission of taxes following the failure of harvest. And at the same time, I think there was also a plague epidemic, which had really been detrimental to agrarian interests in that particular year. And the peasants were finding it very difficult to pay their revenue. The third movement that he led was the Ahmedabad mill strike in 1918. This was a workers' movement against the Indian mill owners, and here the workers were demanding a wage increase and also a bonus. Now, Gandhiji has led these three movements. He has learned a few things about India and how the Indian people would respond to his call for nationalism, and that gives him more confidence. You know, the British actually literally throw an opportunity at Gandhi to start an all India movement, and this was because of the Rowlatt Satyagraha. Now, during the Great War, the First World War actually at that point of time was called the Great War because they didn't know that there was going to be a second war. So, during the Great War of 1914 to 18, the British had instituted censorship of the press, permitted detention without trial, and now on the recommendation of a committee chaired by Sir Sidney Rowlatt, these tough measures were continued. In response, Gandhi called for a countrywide campaign against the Rowlatt Act. Now, why was that? Because during the war, the British government had requested, the various Indian leaders to help and support the British in the war effort, and there was a kind of a promise that the British would consider, giving more autonomy to the Indians, not dominion status, mind you, but some more autonomy. But instead of giving more freedoms, what the British now did was pass the Rowlatt Act. So in towns across North and West India, life comes to a standstill when they're responding to Gandhi's call for the Rowlatt Satyagraha, and he had called for a nationwide bandh. So shops were shut down and schools and colleges were closed. The protests were particularly intense in Punjab, where many men had served on the British side in the war and they expected to be rewarded for their service. But instead, they were actually given the Rowlatt Act, where they could be kept in prison for up to 2 years without any trial or any presentation before the magistrate, and censorship, of course, continued. Gandhiji was detained while he wanted to go to Punjab, and even the local congressmen there were arrested. The situation in the province was growing progressively more tense, and it reached a bloody climax in Amritsar in April 1919, when a British brigadier ordered his troops to open fire on a nationalist meeting. It was actually not even a purely nationalist meeting, it was the Baisakhi Mela happening in the Jallianwala Bagh, and only in one corner actually there was a political speech going on. Otherwise, people had come from around Amritsar, not knowing that actually Amritsar was under curfew, and they had come to enjoy the Mela. More than 400 people were killed in what is known as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and this led to an international outcry against British rule. And it was this Rowlatt Satyagraha which actually now catapults Gandhi into the national stage. So he now gets his opportunity and he organizes the non-cooperation movement. Indians who wished colonialism to end were asked to stop attending schools, colleges, and law courts and not pay any taxes. In some, they were asked to adhere to a renunciation of all voluntary association with the British government. Now, basically, Gandhi said that the number of Britishers in India is very minuscule compared to the millions of Indians, and he says the only way the British could rule over us is, when we are cooperating with them. So the moment we withdraw our cooperation, it will force the British government within the year to give us our Swaraj. So if non-cooperation was effectively carried out, Gandhiji said that India would win Swaraj within the year. To further broaden the struggle, he joined hands with the Khilafat movement that sought to restore the caliphate, a symbol of pan Islamism, which had recently been abolished by the Turkish ruler Kemal Ataturk. So, how did he knit the non cooperation movement and the Khilafat movement into a countrywide popular movement? So, Gandhiji hoped that by coupling the non cooperation movement with Khilafat, India's two major religious communities, that is the Hindus and Muslims, collectively could bring an end to colonial rule in India. The working class went on strike in many towns and cities, and according to official figures, there were 396 strikes in 1921, which involved 600,000 workers and a loss of 7 million workdays. So it was quite effective. The countryside was also seething with discontent. The hill tribes in northern Andhra violated the forest laws. For them, non cooperation meant that forest laws would not be followed anymore. Farmers in Awadh did not pay any taxes. The peasants in Kumaon refused to carry loads for the colonial officials. Peasants, workers, and others interpreted and acted upon the call to not cooperate with colonial rule in ways that best suited their interests rather than conform to the dictates laid down from above. So, non cooperation, writes Mahatma Gandhi's American biographer Louis Fisher, becomes the name of an epoch in the life of India and of Gandhiji. Non cooperation was negative enough to be peaceful, but positive enough to be effective. It entailed denial, renunciation, and self discipline, and it was training for self rule, according to Gandhiji. So, as a consequence of the non cooperation movement, the British Raj was actually shaken to its foundations since the revolt of 1857. And then in February 1922, things took an ugly turn where in Chauri Chaura, a group of peasants attacked the police station and some 22 policemen lost their lives. And Gandhi was very concerned that if he condones this violence, one, he's then not true to the basic ethos of the movement, which was non-violence, and also he feared state repression, that the state machinery was far too powerful to suppress violently the Indian voice and the Indian people. So he decides to call off the movement altogether. So during the non-cooperation movement, thousands of Indians were put in jail. Gandhiji himself was arrested in March 1922. And it's interesting, he's arrested only after he calls off the movement. So that's also quite an interesting timing if you think about it. And he was also charged with sedition. The judge who presided over his trial, Justice C.N. Broomfield, makes a remarkable speech as he's pronouncing his sentence. And he says, and I quote, "It would be impossible to ignore the fact that you are in a very different category from any other person that I have ever tried or am likely to try. It would be impossible to ignore the fact that in the eyes of millions of your countrymen, you are a great patriot and a leader. Even those who differ from you in politics look upon you as a man of high ideals and even of saintly life." But since Gandhiji had violated the law of sedition, it was obligatory for the bench to sentence him to 6 years imprisonment. But then the judge says that if the course of events in India should make it possible for the government to reduce your period of incarceration, no one will be better pleased than I. So Gandhi has also influenced his political opponents. So that's the kind of impact that Gandhian politics really had on the times. So after the non-cooperation movement, Gandhi really emerges as a people's leader. He is catapulted onto the national stage. Most people in India have now heard of him and are, responding to his call for nationalism. So in 1922, Gandhiji had transformed Indian nationalism. He also redeems the promise that he made in BHU when he said that the majority of India actually lies in the villages. And the non-cooperation movement actually does also bring large parts of rural India into the nationalist ambit. It was no longer a movement of professionals and intellectuals anymore. Many of them venerated Gandhiji, referring to him as their Mahatma. They appreciated the fact that he dressed like them, lived like them, and even spoke their language. Unlike other leaders, he did not stand apart from the common folk, but he empathized and even identified with them. Now, in this identification, his dress, how he clothed himself, and the work that he did with the charkha played a very, very important part. So where most of the nationalist leaders initially would dress in Western garments, some of the nationalists were moving towards the Indian garments, but still they were still wearing the clothes of the elite. But Gandhiji actually began to meet people. He gradually, if you see a lot of photographs from that time, you actually see his evolution of his clothes. So he, till he was in South Africa, he did wear his suit, but when he came to India, traveled around a bit, you can see that change. So from wearing the Indian dhoti, kurta, and the pagdi and so on, he actually moves right down to the loincloth, because that's how majority of India dressed. They had no money to buy any more clothes than that. So Gandhi would just wear a loincloth. In winters, he would just add a chadar over it. And he also spent a part of each day working on the charkha and encouraged others to do the same. And he said that this act of spinning allows you to break the boundaries that prevail within the traditional caste system, and also the difference between mental labor and manual labor. Shahid Amin and similar other historians participated in a fascinating study where they traced the image of Mahatma Gandhi among the peasants of Eastern UP, as conveyed by reports and rumors in the local vernacular press. So, when Gandhi traveled to the region in February 1921, he was received by adoring crowds everywhere, and there were so many newspapers which had very interesting reports. One of them was a Hindi newspaper from Gorakhpur, which reported the atmosphere during his speeches. So they are talking about how at Bhatni, Gandhiji was addressing the local public when the train started for Gorakhpur. There were no less than 15 to 20,000 people at Nunkhar, Deodia, Gauri Bazar, Chauri Chaura, and Kusmi station. So as this train is moving ahead, you've got thousands of people who've come to witness this and hear him speak. At Kusmi, the newspaper goes on to say that the station is in the middle of the jungle, yet there were some 10,000 people there. Some were overcome with their love. They could be seen crying. At Deoria, people wanted to give bhaint or donations to Gandhiji. But Gandhiji said they should send this to Gorakhpur, where the local Congress office was. But at Chauri Chaura, one Marwadi gentleman managed to hand over something to him, and then there was no stopping. Apparently, there was a rain of currency notes and coins, and a sheet was spread to collect them, and it was such a sight. And outside the Gorakhpur station, the Mahatma was made to stand on a high carriage, and people took a good darshan of him for a couple of minutes. So you can see that there's almost a deification of Gandhi already. And wherever Gandhiji went, rumors of his miraculous powers spread. In some places, it is said that he'd been sent by the king to redress the grievances of the farmers, and that he had more power over the local British officials. In other places, it was claimed that Gandhiji's power was actually even superior to that of the English monarch. And with his arrival, the colonial rulers would, flee from the district. There were also stories about dire consequences who would oppose Gandhiji. So if you did not believe in Gandhi's powers, then somebody's roof caved in, or the dogs went and bit their goats. Somebody's kadhai of sugarcane juice split into two, and things like that. So known variously as Gandhi Baba, Gandhi Maharaj, or simply as Mahatma, Gandhiji appeared to the Indian peasant as a savior who would rescue them from high taxes and oppressive officials, and restore dignity and autonomy to their lives. Gandhiji's appeal among the poor and the peasants was particularly enhanced also by his ascetic lifestyle, his simple clothing, and the simple food that he ate, and also the fact that he worked on the charkha. So Gandhiji, by caste, he was a merchant. By profession, he was a lawyer. But his simple lifestyle and the love for working with his hands allowed him to empathize with the poorest people, and who in turn, therefore, then were more willing to listen to him. Where most other politicians talked down to them, Gandhiji appeared not just to look like them, but also to understand them and relate to their lives. Now, Gandhiji's success in broadening the base of nationalism was based on very careful organization. So it's not as if he did all of this all by himself. So he had, around him a bunch of very talented people who were very good at organizing people, and all of his satyagrahas that we see were actually part of the success also lies with these other leaders. So the first thing that he also gets the Congress to do is establish new branches in various parts of India, especially in the rural areas, and also a series of Praja Mandals were established in the princely states, right? Remember that the British controlled about 1/3 of India, and about 2/3 of India was still under princely states, so some 560 odd princely states. So nationalism was a little late in coming to these areas under the princely states, and the Praja Mandals were going to have an impact here. Gandhiji also encouraged the communication of the nationalist message in the mother tongue rather than in English. And this also helped local people connect with the local Congress offices. And thus, the provincial committees of the Congress were based on linguistic regions rather than the artificial boundaries of British India. And when India becomes free and the reorganization of states is being undertaken, largely it is based on language. And the history actually goes back to the fact that the Congress committees and the Praja Mandals were largely linguistic in nature. Indian entrepreneurs were very quick to realize that once India became free, the favors that the white industrialists enjoyed at the cost of the Indians would go away. And they actually saw benefit in supporting the nationalist movement. Many of them actually supported the Congress as well. So people like G.D. Birla supported the nationalist movement. So therefore, we see that Gandhi's admirers included both the poor as well as the rich. However, because the reasons why the poor were following Gandhi and why the industrialists were following Gandhi were different. So later on, Congress would face, some problems here. So when they were seen as benefiting the workers, so if the Congress was supporting the workers and the peasants, somewhere the industrialists and the landlord class felt alienated. And if the Congress was seen to be siding with the industrialists and the landlords, the peasants and the workers began to feel threatened. So Congress would deal with this problem, but that's a topic for another time. So between 1917 and 1922, a group of highly talented Indians attached themselves to Gandhiji, and they were the ones who actually helped Gandhi organize India-wide movements. So these people included Mahadev Desai, Vallabhbhai Patel, J.B. Kriplani, Subhash Chandra Bose, Abul Kalam Azad, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sarojini Naidu, Govind Vallabh Pant, and C. Rajgopalachari. And if you notice, all of these people actually came from different parts of the country as well, and also different religious traditions. After 1922, after calling off of the non-cooperation movement, Gandhi decides to kind of take a break from active politics, and what he starts is known as the constructive program. So, which includes promotion of homespun cloth or khadi, abolition of untouchability, getting the Indian society rid itself of social evils such as child marriage, and also working for Hindu-Muslim harmony. So these were four of the very important parts of the constructive program. Prohibition also was a very important part of this constructive program. By prohibition, we mean control of alcohol sale, consumption, and alcoholism, of course. So 1928, things are going to change in India again, which is again going to get Gandhi to come onto the national scene again into active politics. And that is the all-white Simon Commission, which comes from England to India to inquire into the conditions of the colony. So wherever the Simon Commission went, it was greeted with black flags and slogans of Simon Go Back, simply because if you've come to study Indian conditions, why is there no Indian member in the commission? And the work of the Simon Commission was going to be to look at the working of the Government of India Act of 1919 and make their recommendations, because 1929, the next set of Government of India Act was to be passed. So in the Lahore session of 1929, the Indian National Congress did two things, and very significant things. One was the election of Jawaharlal Nehru as the president, which signified the passing of the baton of leadership to the younger generation. And second was a proclamation of the commitment to Purna Swaraj or complete independence. So far, they'd only been talking about home rule or dominion status or Swaraj. But now they have changed their commitment to Purna Swaraj. So this is really important. So 1929 Lahore session, you must remember, is going to be very important. In 1930, on 26 January, Independence Day was now to be observed, with the national flag being hoisted in different venues and patriotic songs would be sung. Now, this is also one of the resolutions that was passed in the Lahore session of 1929. And Gandhiji himself issued precise instructions as to how the day would be observed. It would be good, he said, if the Declaration of Independence is made by whole villages, whole cities even, and would be well if all the meetings were held at the identical minute at all the places. Now, the idea was that every year henceforth, on 26 January, till India actually does gain Purna Swaraj, the Congress was going to observe Independence Day every year. So Gandhiji also suggested that the time of the meeting be advertised in the traditional way by the beating of drums. The celebrations would begin with the hoisting of the national flag. The rest of the day would be spent in doing some constructive work, whether it is spinning or service of untouchables or reunion of Hindus and Muslims or prohibition work or even all of these together. participants would take a pledge affirming that it was the inalienable right of the Indian people, as of any other people, to have freedom and to enjoy the fruits of their toil. And if any government deprives a people of these rights and oppresses them, the people have a further right to alter or abolish it. Now, this obviously comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if you remember class 9 when we talked about the French Revolution. So Gandhi is now ready with the second mass movement, the civil disobedience movement. It was going to start with the Dandi March. So Mahatma Gandhi announces that he would lead a march to break one of the most widely disliked laws in British India. And this law actually gave the state a monopoly in the manufacture and sale of salt. For in every Indian household, salt was indispensable, yet people were forbidden from making salt even for domestic use. This compelled them to buy salt from shops at high prices. The state monopoly over salt was deeply unpopular, and by making it his target, Gandhiji hoped to be able to mobilize a wider discontent against British rule. So on 12th March, Gandhiji begins walking from his ashram at Sabarmati towards the ocean. He reaches his destination in 3 weeks and then makes a fistful of salt on 6th April. And as he did so, he made himself a criminal in the eyes of law. So if you remember, the non-cooperation movement was that we will not cooperate with the British. But civil disobedience takes it a step further and says we will actively disobey British law. So there were numerous other streams of protest across large parts of India. Peasants breached the hated colonial forest laws like earlier. In some towns, factory workers went on strike, lawyers boycotted British courts, and students refused to attend government-run education institutions. Now, we have two sources of information when we talk about Gandhiji's Salt March. One is the secret reports filed by the police, which you will find in the later part of the chapter in your textbook. And you also have the American news magazine, Time, which reported minute to minute Gandhiji's march from Sabarmati Ashram to Dandi. So the officials deputed to monitor his movements, they filed these secret reports, and these reproduce the speeches he gave at the villages en route, in which he called upon local officials to renounce government employment and join the freedom struggle. The police spies reported that Gandhiji's meetings were very well attended by villagers of all castes and by women as well as men. They observed that thousands of volunteers were flocking to the nationalist cause, and among them were many officials who had resigned from their posts and the colonial government as well. Writing to the government, the district superintendent of police remarked that Mr. Gandhi appears calm and collected. He is gathering more strength as he proceeds. But for some strange reason, which Gandhi also finds surprising, that he's not arrested so quickly. They allow him to complete his Dandi march and break the salt law. Then when you look at the American news magazine Time, the magazine starts by being very scornful of Gandhiji and his looks, and they write with disdain of his spindly frame and his spidery loins. Thus, in its first report on the march, Time was deeply skeptical of the Salt March reaching its destination. It claimed that Gandhiji sank to the ground at the end of the second day's walking. The magazine did not believe the emaciated saint would be physically able to go much further, but within the week, it had changed its mind. The massive popular following that the march had garnered but within the week it had changed its mind. The massive popular following that the march had garnered, wrote Time, had made the British rulers desperately anxious. Gandhiji himself was now saluted as the saint and statesman who was using Christian acts as weapons against men with Christian beliefs. The Salt March was notable for three important reasons. First, it was this event that first brought Mahatma Gandhi to world attention, thanks largely to the Time magazine article. The march was widely covered by European and American press as well. Second reason why it was so notable is that it was the first time that women participated in large numbers. The social activist Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay had persuaded Gandhiji not to restrict the protest to men alone. Kamala Devi was herself one of the numerous women who courted arrest by breaking the salt or liquor laws. And thirdly, why it was important is because of the Salt March forced this realization upon the British that their Raj would not last forever and that they would have to give the Indians some power at least. So this is where the Gandhi-Irwin Pact came into the picture. So Lord Irwin, who was the Viceroy of India at that time, he invited Gandhiji for talks, and as a result of their talks, they reached the following agreement that firstly, Gandhiji would call off the civil disobedience movement. On the part of Irwin, he promised that all political prisoners who were not accused of violent acts would be released, that salt manufacture would be allowed along the coast by individuals without a license also. And then Gandhiji agreed to attend the second roundtable conference. The Gandhi-Irwin Pact was actually criticized by radical nationalists for Gandhiji was unable to obtain from Viceroy a commitment to political independence for Indians. So they all criticized Gandhi, saying that, what about the resolution of Purna Swaraj? You've not been able to get us Purna Swaraj, and you're calling off the meeting, calling off the movement. So in 1931, Gandhiji attends a second roundtable conference. However, his claims that the Congress represented all of India actually was challenged by three groups of Indians. The first challenge was from the Muslim League, who claimed that they were the sole representatives of the Muslim minority. The second challengers were the native princes, who claimed that the Congress had no stake in their territories. And the third opposition came from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who argued that Gandhiji and the Congress actually represented the upper caste and they did not represent the interests of the lower castes. So, because of this debate, the second roundtable conference remained inconclusive. There was a third one where again Gandhiji did not attend, and as a result of this, the British put together the Government of India Act of 1935. Now, according to this act, some representative power was given to the Indians. 2 years later, in an election held on the basis of restricted franchise, the Congress won a comprehensive victory, and in 8 out of 11 provinces which went to vote, you had a Congress Prime Minister who would work under the supervision of a British governor. They did have a fair amount of power, but whatever legislation that the new Indian legislatures would pass could be vetoed by the British governors. So, not a lot of power, but definitely some improvement from the previous times. So in September 1939, 2 years after the Congress ministries had assumed office in 1937, the Second World War had broken out. Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru had both been strongly critical of Hitler and the Nazis, and accordingly they promised that Congress would support the war effort of the British, but the British in return had to promise to grant India her independence once hostility had ended. This offer, of course, was refused. So in protest, the Congress ministries resigned in October 1939. Through 1940 and 1941, the Congress organized a series of individual satyagrahas. Gandhi felt that now was not the time to start an all India movement, even though there were some elements within the Congress which supported that. But Gandhiji prevailed, and in these 2 years, actually from 1939 to 1941, there were only individual satyagrahas which were being offered. In March 1940, the Muslim League passes the Pakistan Resolution, which demanded a measure of autonomy for the Muslim majority areas of the subcontinent. So the political landscape becomes more complex. It's not the Indians versus the British anymore. It's now a three-way struggle between the Congress, the Muslim League, and the British. At this time, Britain had an all-party government whose Labour members were more sympathetic to the Indian demand for independence. But Winston Churchill, the Conservative Prime Minister, was a die-hard imperialist who insisted that he had not been appointed the king's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. In the spring of 1942, Churchill was then persuaded to send one of his ministers, Sir Stafford Cripps, to come to India and try and forge a compromise with Gandhi and the Congress. Well, the talks broke down because the Cripps mission was not authorized to grant complete independence to India just then. So talks break down. However, after the Congress insisted that if it was to help the British defend India from the Axis powers, then the Viceroy had to first appoint an Indian as a defense member of his executive council. Now, this demand also was turned down. So the Cripps mission returns to England after failing. So Mahatma Gandhi then decided.